Thanks for tuning in to My Valley, His Victory, hosted by me, Mackenzie Smith, where I interview Christians who love the outdoors and have walked through valleys in their lives. In a world of highlight reels and surface-level relationships, we all have faced hardships. I believe our experiences can be encouraging to others if we have the courage to be vulnerable. 2 Corinthians 1 says, "The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." My goal is to inspire you to come to the Creator through His creation and connect you with Christians who have been through similar experiences. I pray that this podcast encourages you if you are in a valley and pushes you to share how God has turned your past valley into His victory. This year, my goal is to spend more time worshiping the Creator and His creation, and to do that with like-minded women. So I partnered up with Audrey from the Trail North. We are bringing you 2 Christian women's retreats in Divide, Colorado later this year. Over this long weekend, you'll meet like-minded women who want to grow in community, worship in the outdoors, and challenge themselves personally. I can't wait to hang out with you, so shoot me an email at myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com for more information or the registration link. Spots are filling up, so be sure to reserve yours today. On today's episode of My Valley, His Victory, we have Brock Wiebe. Brock is a worship leader at a church in Ontario, Canada, and he is also an indie Christian rock artist, a lover of the outdoors, and a follower of Jesus. Thank you so much for being with us today, Brock.
Yeah, totally. So stoked to be here.
Yeah, I know I just read your bio, but why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Brock Wiebe. I am a worship leader, like she said. I'm working on my music right now, so kind of doing kind of like an indie rock thing. And then I love the outdoors. And so when you said something about this, I was really stoked about that. I love hiking and climbing and everything. So yeah, really pumped to be on something like this.
Yeah. You said you like climbing and hiking. Is there any other things in the outdoors, or kind of what's there to do in Ontario, Canada? I've never been there.
Yeah. So one of my favorite things is usually like kind of small through hikes in Algonquin Park. There's a bunch of just like trails. So that's kind of like my Ontario hiking spot that I usually go to. It's a couple hours away from us, and it's just like, yeah, provincial park. And so like hiking and camping. I love winter hiking. That's something that I've really gotten into, which is a bit of like an adventure, but really fun and a good learning curve. So that's probably my favorite thing is winter camping. But yeah, rock climbing is one of the things I've recently got into, which has been there's a good community in that. And then it's just a good exercise, I guess, too. It's a good way to clear your mind. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you climb in a gym or do you climb outdoors?
So mostly gym climbing, yeah. There's not a lot of great rocks around here. There's there's a few like gorges and stuff, but nothing crazy. So
okay.
Yeah, my main thing is hiking.
Okay. And you said you like to camp and hike in the wintertime in Canada?
Yeah. So it's a whole thing. It kind of started a few years ago. I got really kind of invested in just like watching videos of it, and had no idea how to do it, but I just started like kind of researching and figuring out ways to do it in a way that I wouldn't die. And then winter hiking when it's really snowy is kind of a skill, and so because of that, I got excited about that because I had to prepare a little more, which was fun. So
yeah, I have so many questions. Isn't
Yeah.
Canada like negative 30 degrees below in the wintertime?
It can, yeah. It was. I think when I went last, it was like, I don't know, maybe like negative 15.
Do you have to dig a place in the snow, or do you just camp on top of the snow?
So you usually dig a trench. You dig a pathway and dig a trench, for your tents, and then you also dig a trench for like your fire, and that kind of keeps the wind away from it. And then for like sleeping and stuff, even if you don't have like a super warm sleeping bag, you kind of like, what I do is I'll use like hot water bags, and that's kind of like it doesn't last usually all night, so it's but usually you can stay relatively warm. It's something I want to get better at yet, but
Oh my gosh, that sounds wild. I'm like
Uh,
thinking through all the logistics of that, and I'm like,
yeah.
man, that's cold. I see people do it on Instagram all the time, but I'm like,
Yeah.
you got to be real prepared for that.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's really worth it though. Like it's really hard. Building a fire is hard. Everything's kind of hard. But when you do it, I don't know, there's like a freedom in it too. Like you're doing it in the winter, which is like kind of an accomplishment maybe.
Yeah. Do you have to snowshoe or how do you?
Yeah, you usually snowshoe, and it takes about twice as long to get anywhere. Maybe more than that, and it's way harder.
All
I
right.
would explain it like, when you get to like 12,000 feet and you start getting tired.
Yep.
It's about like that. It feels like you're at high elevation, and so it's and so it just takes a bit longer that way. But yeah.
So you like a good challenge.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing in all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that's probably your favorite thing to do is winter camping.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love canoeing and kayaking out to spots too, and a lifelong dream has been to do like the PCT or something. But probably what I'm most proud of or like happy to talk about is my winter camping. I love summer camping though too, and usually people are more into summer camping, and so yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But if you're Canadian, I don't know. I feel like everyone that I see that does this winter camping is Canadian. And I'm like, they must be built differently.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Is that like the rite of passage to becoming a Canadian is you have to learn how to camp in the winter?
See, I don't even know. I don't have many people in my life that do it. So I'm kind of like one of the only people I know that does it. It's just not like, even Canadians are a little afraid, at least in, I'm kind of the southern point in Canada. And so we're not like as acclimated to the cold as maybe what, like other provinces are. But yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And are you from Canada?
Yeah. Born and raised here, about 3 hours from the border, I would say.
Okay.
Into Michigan. So
I just knew we had talked on our previous call about you living in Colorado for a while. So I couldn't remember if Canada was home or if it was.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So talking about the outdoors, how does the outdoors play a role in your relationship with Christ?
Yeah. So around the time I started getting into winter camping as like kind of an interest, I mean, I should back up. It's always kind of been a thing, but I would say that it reached kind of a point of like necessity. Maybe 3 years ago, I was going through kind of like a season of darkness, we'll say. And I knew that I needed to be outside. And so there was a few things I did that God really met me through. One was just I live in the woods. And so I went out on a hike, just a small one, and kind of in my backyard, and would just bring my Bible and kind of like talk to God. But then, so also I would say though that like when I planned a trip to kind of do winter camping, and that was kind of my strategy to kind of like hope that God would meet me in a sense. And so I always found that God met me most in the outdoors. I think one of the things is, was born in the 90s, and, with the beginnings of what we have now of technology. And I, just like anyone else, I really struggle to prioritize silence and to prioritize like stillness. And I have found that the one way I am focused and the one way I'm focused and able to like disconnect from the things that can and don't always, but definitely can drag me down or even just distract me is like the one way is going outside. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's a human experience. And so that's a big reason for me is I really think can really process and focus well when I'm moving. And so one way to do that is to go on long walks, or hiking or whatever, and why not do that where it's pretty? And so I would say that's the main reason why.
Yeah. I think that's one of those things stands out so much in what you said, in that you process more when you're moving. And I think that is actually like a big realization that I had earlier this year when I was doing this thing called the 12-hour walk. Is it's like when you sit in all of your emotions and you sit in whatever you're dealing with, whether that be anxiety, depression, like if you just sit, it's going to just continue to like bubble and, come to the surface, and it's just going to feel stagnant.
100%.
But I think there's something, I'm sure there's a scientific study out there somewhere about it, but I know I've experienced this, and I'm thankful to hear that you've experienced as well, is that when you move your body, it actually helps your brain move as well. And for me, when I'm moving and I'm going through these things, I have a much more positive and hopeful mindset than I do if I'm just like sitting.
100%. Yeah, that's good to hear that I'm not the only one.
No, that is something I probably would have never said I had a realization of until this year, when I went and did this thing called the 12-hour walk, and it just spent a lot of time thinking and processing
that's wild. That's
all
amazing.
of the things. But yeah. So do you have a specific story about being in the outdoors where you just really felt like God revealed himself, or that you were just really close to him?
Yeah, totally. So I would say that it was the I'm saying like January or February of 2021. I'd just gotten back I had lived in Colorado for about a year with a mission, and had a really great time. But kind of halfway through that, had kind of like a crash, just spiritually and mental health wise. And so I remember going out to the woods, kind of like looking for God, and I opened my Bible up. It's like this open area of like trees all around me, but kind of found a place to sit, and I just opened my Bible up, and I don't really think this is the way we're supposed to do it, but God really worked in me through it. And it was just like I opened my Bible up, it was like, God, I need a word from you. And I came across Lamentations 3, and the verses are talking about this prophet is kind of talking to God, asking him why, kind of where he is. And I just remember reading, therefore I call to mind, therefore I have hope that the steadfast love of the Lord does not fail. His mercies are new every morning, great is his faithfulness. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. Though the Lord, I've never understood this verse, but something about like, though he pushes us off for a little bit, he doesn't forever. And I think it was this prophet like really frustrated, and I was frustrated, and he was lost and I was lost, and yet he still believed that God would be good to him. So like that was a moment, I think, in the outdoors where I really found like a love for it in a new way. That was kind of like the climax of it for me. So yeah.
Yeah. What a good verse to stumble upon in that moment. And I think it's interesting. I, have heard people say that the things like that have happened where it's like they just open their Bible and they, get the word from God. And I'm like, I know that has happened for sure. And it's always great when it does, because I know sometimes, you can open the Bible and it's like, what does all of this really mean? But it's really cool whenever you can find something in that moment when you really needed something to relate to.
Totally.
And that's just what you happen to stumble upon in that moment. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Maybe I'll finish it with saying, I don't think that is the way to do it. And I really want to make sure people know that. Like, I don't think that that's God's main way of speaking to us. I don't think that we should be superstitious about the Bible, or like opening it up and God just means what he says there for our specific situation. Like, I think God does that sometimes, and it's as much of a miracle as it is when someone says something that really means something to where you're at without knowing. It's not like, I don't think that's something to rely on.
Yeah. Not something to do in your everyday reading the Bible.
Totally. Yeah.
So I know that you said that you live in Ontario, and I think you said that is, I'm not super familiar, but I think you said that it's more of like a city, right?
Yeah, so kind of. It's like I live in the country, but there's a lot of city surrounding us. And so most of Canada's really not populated, but we kind of live in the populated area.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So for maybe a listener who lives in a place like Ontario that is a city and is not strictly known for the outdoors, what piece of encouragement or what piece of advice would you give them to connect with God through the outdoors in a place that may be more urban?
Yeah. Well, again, I would say I don't feel like where I live is super urban, but I also know that we're not super outdoorsy, and so we don't have like mountains, and we don't have great hiking, and we don't have all the things that maybe you would think of. So I guess one thing from my experience is that I think God meets you in silence a lot easier, and not that he's not meeting us in the busyness of life, but I think it's easier to hear things when there's not a lot of noise. And so I've noticed that I can walk down my road and feel like I'm in the outdoors in a sense, or I can, walk in my backyard and get away from people for a little bit. And, while it's not like I'm not in Red Rocks, or I'm not in the Garden of the Gods or whatever, I'm not on the summit, I still think that there's beauty there. And I think it's important to just take small opportunities to do that, because ordinary is okay too, and not extremely cool is still beautiful. And I've really found that to be true, that I don't need to be on a mountain or wherever to find beauty and to enjoy a good hike.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good word. Okay, so switching gears a little bit into the title of this podcast, My Valley, His Victory. And I know you've talked about, being in some low spots already, but I want to dive into some of those a little bit more. So can you tell us about a season of, I think you said darkness, but I'm going to call it a valley, or, a season of wilderness that you went through and that you experienced, and kind of what God taught you or prepared you for in that season?
Sure, yeah. So I would say the valley that I probably would say was the lowest kind of place I've ever been in my life was after this ministry time in Colorado. I was part of a small ministry. I wasn't really involved with as many people, just kind of involved in a discipleship program, really kind of meeting God, and God had been really good. I think I'd met Jesus in kind of like a new way that I would have thought of as almost like a salvation thing about a year before, and everything changed for me. I thought different. I felt different about things. The Bible came alive to me, and truly was such a beautiful time. And so through that, I really focused on God, and not anything I did. Like, he just was really good to me and leading me. And so I got back home from Colorado, living with a bunch of guys in a dorm, and kind of crashed in a sense, where I began to like have these like kind of horrible, like, I guess, thoughts, not against anybody in particular, but just doubting God and anti my faith and anti everything I kind of cared about. And I remember sitting outside, I was watching this like video. I was really into theology, and I the question was raised, like, why does God command us to worship him? And that was a question I didn't know I had. It was like a kind of like a thorn in my side where I just couldn't get rid of it. And the question was, if he commands me to worship him, is he just egotistical? And with all these thoughts that were kind of in my head, and I realized, later on, it was more of like I never got diagnosed, so I want to be really careful with this, but it felt a lot like OCD, and from what I understand. And so it was horrible. I couldn't cope, kind of. I would be like kind of falling apart all hours of the day, couldn't take my mind off of it, just really tormenting, and all the things. And so, but my kind of like heart was not, I could not open my heart to God. And all this time I'm like praying, God, have mercy on me, like, be kind to me. And my internal thing is like, this is hell. And at the same time, like how I would explain it is that it almost feels like you're being kind of cradled over hell and being told that, any minute now we're going to drop you. And I had this unhealthy fear of God and this like fear of doing things wrong, and it drove me to anger at God, and it drove me to distaste for anything from the church, and it drove me to anger at people and dislike of people, not as a whole, but just that I couldn't really love them because I wasn't really able to see that God had anything good for me. I kind of thought that he truly I kind of thought that he hated me. And so yeah, it was a horrible kind of season. And so I would kind of say that I was really wrestling with this and fighting with it, and I mean I couldn't really cope. My relationships were kind of failing, and I think I probably hurt people through that season. And I couldn't talk to people. I couldn't have these deep relationships because I had nothing to say. I was just afraid of any conversations about God because it might bring up this pain that I was like, well, God doesn't love me. He loves you, but he kind of threw me away. I messed up too much. And so, yeah, I mean, I would just, those are the thoughts, and I couldn't have, my Christian friends became aware that, the Brock we knew before is really not, the one we know now, and he's not able to have these conversations. And, I quit leading worship for the most part. I didn't really want to be seen in that place. I became really aware of my hypocrisy, and so I was aware that if I was to lead worship but have this internal conflict in my head about why I don't want to worship, I would be missing, I would be a hypocrite. And so I'll explain that a bit more. It's not that I didn't want to worship God, it's that I couldn't. There was an internal battle where I wanted to, and yet I did not want to at all. And the only way I would explain that is spirit and flesh kind of fighting, where there's just this big internal battle. And so fought through this for a long time, and slowly I started kind of just learning to trust again. And I started reading my Bible again, and I started praying again. And I don't mean those things in a legalistic way of this is what you have to do for God to love you. But those are the things that helped me. And so I started doing that, and I implemented this practice of every Saturday I would go to this coffee shop and I would read the Bible, and I would read a good book, and usually a book focused on something about faith that was what I needed at the time. And I would just kind of try to make space for God even when I wasn't really able to hear. And so John Mark Comer always talks about he's someone I was a fan of, and he would always talk about Sabbath. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do in my own little way, was just to spend time Sabbathing with God by myself. And it became a really helpful practice for me during that season of being able to kind of hear God, even though I didn't think I was hearing anything. What I was understanding was that God wanted me to be with him, and maybe being with him was enough. And so through that season, I started phasing back into leading worship. I started, being able to have those conversations again. And so I would do once every couple months, I would lead worship again, and people kept pressuring me to do it, and I would say no most of the time, but every now and then I would do it because I really felt that was something I'm supposed to do. And so that was the beginning of my kind of healing journey. And I think it's important to know that things like that don't just snap out of it. I was really looking for God to just do something where all of a sudden I could say, okay, God, you're really good, and I don't have problems with this anymore. And it didn't happen. And I no hate towards anyone who has that happen. That's really cool. And I don't think we should be calloused in saying that it never does. I just don't think that wasn't my reality. And so, yeah, started leading worship and spending more time with God and finding people to talk to. And then I started working on this music as well, and that was something that was really good for me. A friend of mine, new friend, I guess, kind of called me and said, can I produce your album? And that was really cool. And so I got to write these songs about like struggling with the faith and being angry about faith, and then also needing God and realizing that at the end of the day, my anger and my frustration is not to God. It's really just my misinterpretation of God. And God just really started giving me a heart to love him more and to trust him more. And so through all of that, I would say I'm much more at peace with who God is. I'm not striving anymore to be good enough, and I'm not angry anymore. And I think I wouldn't be able to I wouldn't be ready to be a friend of God in this way if I hadn't lost my need to perform to him. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you said there at the end, the need to perform for him. I think that's a huge thing that I think a lot of us struggle with. And just so thankful that you are sharing all of this. And I'm so thankful that you're talking about it because, I think on this podcast so far, we've talked a lot about, a lot of trauma and a lot of betrayal and a lot of hurts. And sometimes it can just happen in our own mind and we can really struggle with ourselves. Like no one else has to be involved. And so I just thank you for sharing, because I think that this is something that so many people are going to relate to. And also just, I think, you touched on being a new believer, having this overwhelming love for God, but then kind of finding this lull after that. And so I think that this is going to be also encouraging to new believers who, maybe start out strong like you did and then kind of settle into that lull, and that what does it really look like to honor God? And then, thirdly, I think I know I'm encouraged because I think being someone who's in, church leadership from a worship leader standpoint, it's really easy to think that, those people just love God with their whole heart and that they're just so on fire for the Lord and kind of they're untouchable. And, I think we have these, they're always false, but, I think a lot of us have these false realities of people that work in the church and that their lives are just awesome and that they don't struggle. And so I know this is really encouraging. I say to hear that you struggle, but, to just know that we're all human and that even if you're, doing what God's calling you to do and you're in ministry and if you're in, the church, like we're still going to struggle, but it, comes down to at the end of the day, like, what are we going to do with that struggle and where are we going to turn?
Totally. Yeah, I agree.
So I know that you had talked about just really questioning God. What tilted the scales to go back to God for the answers versus going away from God? Because I think that that's a point where a lot of people reach where they have all these questions. And I think that's where a lot of people walk away from the faith.
Yeah. But
instead, it's almost like you ran towards the faith and really just, I love what you did. You did things without maybe feeling them, but what you knew were right. Instead of, I think people chase this feeling to lead to the action.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not completely sure. I think there's a few answers, and I think the main one would be that truly God is gracious and he doesn't seem to, like, he hasn't let me go. That's like the answer that I think is the truest. But I would also say there were some things that kept me, and one was that I had this friend. His name is Matthew, and I met him kind of in the pit of my despair, and he just started talking to me and really like would invite me over just to talk about what I'm wrestling with, and also just to be compassionate. Like, he didn't have a goal of making me perfect, but rather he loved Jesus and he wanted me to know that God was kind, and he would sit in sorrow with me, and he would also lead me closer to Christ. And I think like community is a really important thing in things like this. I would also say that I was afraid of where I would go if I didn't continue to follow God. and I didn't like that person very much. And I didn't, even when I was calloused and kind of angry at God and angry at people, I didn't like that. And I didn't like who I was. And because in my heart of hearts, I wanted to follow God, and I wanted to. And so it was really conflicting for me to even to choose a road that would be running away from God would have been actually betraying who I was, and it wouldn't have been true. I can kind of search for authenticity to a fault, and so that was one of the things that I couldn't do. Like I couldn't lead worship when I was in the pit, but I also couldn't leave when I was there because I had experienced God in a way that was life changing, and because it changed everything in my life, I couldn't walk away from that, knowing that like that would be treating God kind of like a high, where it's just like I get a high and then I leave when it's over. That's not what I wanted to do, and so, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really good word. Don't just use God in the highs, but stick with them in the lows.
Totally.
So going through this and going through these highs and these lows with God, what's kind of the main thing that you've taken away? Like, why do you think you went through this? What was maybe the moment of realization of like, that's what God was trying to teach me?
Totally. I would say something that I learned recently was that I've gotten this from a few people, and it's this statement of like, so I have a few friends who don't love Jesus anymore and who have run away from the faith, and or maybe even want Jesus but are hurt from the church and don't really want to go to church, and just kind of lost when it comes to faith. And so I was talking to some, and they were just telling me kind of like that my faith was really pure, and that it didn't feel like I wasn't angry at the church, but I was also able to love them. And I think, and so that's not a kind of tire pump for me. I really do believe that that's nothing I've done, and that like a season like that really gives you grace for people. Because I know, like, during parts of that season, even I wasn't there yet where I could, like, I was still kind of a pious Christian who thought he knew things, and I still think I know things, but I'm learning that when it comes to how I love people around me, I'm called to be gracious with them first, to love them in spite of where they're at. And I don't think I'm not making a statement of like, sin is okay and like just leave people there. But I think that one of the most convicting things is to be a person of love and to be someone who is obedient to Christ while also loving people who aren't. And so that is something that I've learned. I sometimes find it easier to understand people who really struggle than understand people who try to hide that, because maybe we can actually get somewhere. And so that's I would say I've learned to be gracious, and still learning, and I'm sure people who know me would say, yeah, you could be a little more gracious yet, and I'm sure that's true. But having said that, I would say that I'm learning to be gracious.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's your perspective, and that you have learned how to be more gracious to those who aren't fully living for Christ. And I think that's a really good thing to learn, because I think that maybe let's say the Christian you were before would have pushed people even further away from the church. And so now, you can really understand, and you can just have that sympathy and have that understanding. So then you can minister to them even better.
Amen. Yeah, that's awesome.
So looking back on your journey and the season of wilderness that you went through, if someone listening is maybe going through a similar season, do you have any words of encouragement or a piece of advice for them in the midst of it when they don't have the perspective that you have?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I'm going to sound really cliche, but I think that sometimes cliches are good. Community is so important, and who you spend time with is where you will go. And so I would say number one is be around people that aren't angry at the church, who aren't angry at God, and who want the best for you. I think those are important. Be around people that are gracious while also not compromising on truth, who are able to love God and you, and not just do one of them. So I would say that's the one thing, and that sounds like more like a principle. I don't mean it to sound like that. I just think that's super important. I would say the second one is to let yourself be loved. And you can't choose to trust, but you can choose to receive love. And maybe not everyone can do that even. But if you can, I think when you read the Bible, remind yourself of what the cross means for you, and not and if you can't read the Bible, or if that's too hard right now, I would say remind yourself of what people say about God, the best parts, because I think sometimes it's hard to hear it from the Word, and it can seem inconsistent when you're in this place. But I would say that people around you want to love you, and chances are that there's maybe someone who does. And so if they say something nice to you, just receive it. Like, I don't think it's helpful to push that away all the time. Part of loving Christ is allowing yourself to be loved by his body. And you can't do that if you don't receive it. And so that sounds also really cliche, and I don't like kind of the way that's spoken always, but I think that is true. When you're lost, you need to receive love. And then I guess thirdly, I would say, do your best to be in the Word and in prayer when you can. And maybe that's spending 10 minutes before you start your day in the Word or prayer, but read things like the Psalms, and read things like John maybe, and read chapters of the Bible that speak of God's kindness. And I think things like that, like I don't think it's helpful if you're in this place to read about judgment right now. Like I think it could be good for when you need to read that, but I think it's important to read the right things. And there's a lot of good books that will lead you somewhere, and ultimately I think the Bible is the main thing, but I've read a lot of really good books that helped me along my journey. One of them was The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. It was really beautiful. He's like this monk, I believe a monk or something from like Spain in like the 1500s. But it's widely recommended as the greatest book on prayer. I would read that. It's kind of a short book, and it's really concise. It has a lot of old language, but I think that if you can get through that, if you can stomach that, there's a lot of gold in it. And so I would just, read good books. Be careful what you take in. I think social media is a dangerous place, and I like it and I hate it. And I think there are people who want to see you flourish in the kingdom of God, and there are people who want to see you leave it all together and follow the people that want to make you flourish, or don't use it. I say that, I don't mean that you can ever read things that are contrary to your worldview. I think that's important. But when you're about to lose your worldview, I think those voices are loud enough, and maybe it's helpful to just hear the voice of God. If you truly believe in him, then do that. So I would say that that's my answer. It's kind of long, and I didn't mean to make it sound like principles. I think God is the main thing, that God is what will do it. But those things, I think, are just ways of entrusting yourself to God in that process.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those pieces of encouragement and those pieces of advice. I think those are going to be really helpful to someone listening. And I just want to say thank you again for sharing and being willing to be vulnerable and being willing to share the hard times, because, like you were talking about, the social media can be a good way to see all of the good in someone else's life and think that we're the only person struggling. And so, that's my whole hope with this podcast, is that we also share the struggles, because the highs are good, but we all are going to experience the lows. Yeah. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing. And like I said, I just know that this is going to impact so many, because it is something that I think that a lot of people struggle with. They struggle internally in their own brain with truths and with things. And I think it's also just so encouraging because you are, a leader in the church. And so just want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great.
And for those that want to follow along with your journey, or I know we talked about you being an artist, a musician, where can they find you and where can they keep up with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Brock Wiebe Music. That's kind of mainly where I would be. I have a pretty small but loyal following there of friends and family and some onlookers. And so that's kind of where I've started doing my music thing. I would say that I'm putting an album out in March is kind of the set time. And so if you're from Ontario, come to my opening show, or else just follow along. So I think start releasing music in March. And so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, that's kind of where you'll find me.
And will that album be on Spotify, Apple Music, all the things?
It'll be everywhere. I'm hoping to do a music video or two as well. And so hopefully kind of everywhere, including YouTube. So yeah.
Very fun. So excited for that, and excited to hear that when it comes out. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brock.
Yeah, thank you. It was great. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of My Valley, His Victory. If you or someone you know are interested in being on this podcast, please email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com.